The sun hung low over the hills of Rome as the vast city below hummed with the familiar rhythm of a republic on the edge of monumental change. In the midst of it all, a young woman stood at the threshold of history. Julia, born into the ancient and proud Julian family, had always known she was destined for greatness. But greatness in ancient Rome was never a matter of choice. It was a burden, an inheritance, and often curse. The year was 157 BCE, and Julia's world was one of privilege and tradition. Her family, the Julii, were among the oldest and most influential of Roman patrician lines. They had shaped the destiny of the Republic for centuries. But as with all great families, the weight of power often came with its own set of dangers. Julia was raised in the shadow of her father, Gaius Julius Caesar, a man of substantial power, though not yet the legend he would become in the annals of history. As a girl, she was groomed for a life that would follow the intricate dance of Roman politics, a game where marriages were alliances and love was often secondary to loyalty and ambition. Yet, in the quiet moments between grand feasts and political banter, Julia dreamed of something else, something more than being the pawn in an unceasing game of power. She was beautiful, as all the Julii women were, with pale skin that glowed like marble and hair as dark as a midnight sky. But beauty alone did not secure one's future in Rome. It was through marriage that Julia would rise, though little did she know. Her union with Gaius Marius would not only change the course of her life but also of the Republic itself. It was a marriage not just of love, but of necessity. Marius, a man who was not born into the high stations of Rome, had clawed his way up through the ranks of the military, his ambition as vast as the lands he sought to conquer. At the time, Rome was a city of splendor and decay, its legions the might of the world. But its politics were unstable, fractured by a vicious struggle for power among the elite. The choice of Marius as her husband might have been practical, even expected, but for Julia, it was a leap into the unknown. Her life, thus far marked by the soft rhythms of aristocratic life, was about to be thrust into the storm of military campaigns, political intrigue, and the brutal realities of war. As the night descended over the city, the world Julia had known, her family's quiet influence, her father's fading legacy, began to unravel. Marius, a man who would eventually become Rome's most powerful general, was about to step into a role that would define his destiny and hers. Together, they would change Rome forever. Julia had always known that her family's name carried weight in Rome, but as a child, she could scarcely imagine the complexities of that weight. The great house of the Julii had been one of the founding families of Rome, tracing its lineage back to the time of the Republic's birth. Her father, Gaius Julius Caesar, though not yet the powerful statesman he would later become, was already a figure of growing prominence. Julia's early years were spent in the palatial villa in the hills outside Rome, a place where marble statues of gods and great statesmen lined the corridors, and the air was always thick with the conversation of politics. Her mother, Aurelia, was a woman of quiet intelligence, whose every word was measured with care. Though not as powerful in her own right as some of Rome's other matroni, Aurelia held influence within the family and among the Roman elite. She taught Julia the subtlety of Roman politics, how to listen more than speak, how to observe with sharp eyes, and how to navigate the labyrinthine social structures of Rome. These lessons, though not always spoken aloud, were imprinted upon Julia's mind. She knew that every action in Rome had its consequence, and that for women of her station, marriage was not merely a matter of love, but an instrument of power. As a young girl, Julia was raised with a sense of duty to her family, her name, and the Republic itself, while she spent her days in the opulent villa, attending to her studies and learning the skills necessary for a highborn Roman woman. The outside world moved with a pace that she could scarcely follow. There were rumors of war, of political strife within the Senate, of generals rising to power, whispers that Julia only half understood. But one thing was certain: the fate of the Julii was intertwined with that of Rome. When Julia was barely out of childhood, her life was altered by a series of events she could not have anticipated. The Republic, which had stood for centuries as a model of Roman strength, was beginning to show cracks in its foundation. It was during this time that Gaius Marius, a man of humble origins, had begun to rise within the military ranks. Marius had a reputation that spoke volumes. He was not born into the patrician class, but he had managed to carve out a career as a military commander, earning favor with the Senate and the people alike. Marius's early military career was marked by his role in the Jugurthine War from 111 BCE to 105 BCE, a conflict in which Rome fought against Jugurtha, the king of Numidia. The war itself was complicated, filled with political machinations, bribery, and betrayal. Marius had proven himself not only as a capable commander, but as a man who understood the power of personal ambition. At the time, Rome's legions were manned by the wealthy elite, men who could afford to buy their way into the military. But Marius saw this as a flaw in Rome's army and proposed a radical solution. He opened the legions to the Cappaecensi, the poorest class of citizens. In doing so, Marius redefined the Roman army, creating a professional military force that was loyal not to the Senate but to its general. This was a shift that would alter the course of Roman history. For Julia, however, the story of Marius was not just that of a brilliant military leader, but of a man who, through his ambition and his reforms, had drawn the attention of powerful men and women alike. Marius's early political moves had caught the eye of the Julii family, and as Julia grew older, she became more aware of the political alliances that were forming around him. It was clear that Marius, though not a man of noble birth, was a rising star in Roman politics. His military victories had earned him fame, and his political acumen was unmatched. In 107 BCE, he was elected consul, an extraordinary achievement for a man of his background. Consuls were the highest officials in the Republic, and Marius's rise to this position was a testament to his ability to navigate the treacherous waters of Roman politics. Julia's father, Gaius Julius Caesar, recognized that Marius's rise represented an opportunity, one that could not be ignored. Caesar was a man who understood the game of politics, and he knew that Marius's success could benefit the Julii family. But this was not just a matter of personal gain. It was about the survival of the Republic itself. With political tensions rising, and with rival factions vying for power, Caesar saw the necessity of forming alliances with men like Marius, whose military genius could secure Rome's future. And so, it was decided that Julia would marry Gaius Marius, uniting two powerful families for the benefit of the Republic. The marriage was not born of love, at least not in the way most would understand it. It was a strategic alliance, a union that would ensure the Julii family's continued influence in Rome, while also consolidating Marius's position as a political force. Julia, though young, understood the weight of the decision. She had been raised to believe that duty came first. Above all else, she was not given a choice in the matter, but that was the way of things in Rome. Women, especially women of her class, were not meant to have their own desires. They were meant to marry well, produce heirs, and maintain the family name. It was a responsibility Julia accepted, though she could not fully understand the magnitude of it. The marriage ceremony was a lavish affair, as befitted the union of two powerful families. The streets of Rome were lined with banners, and the air was thick with the scent of flowers and incense. Julia, dressed in a gown of white and gold, entered the temple of Jupiter, where the ceremony would take place. Gaius Marius stood at the altar, his eyes fixed upon her. He was a man who had seen war and bloodshed, a man whose hands were calloused from the grips of his sword. But as Julia stepped forward, he saw in her not just the daughter of a powerful family, but the key to his political future. Their marriage was the beginning of a new chapter, for both of them, and for Rome itself. The marriage between Julia and Gaius Marius was more than a union of two people. It was the weaving together of two ambitions, two futures, and two families bound by fate and necessity. As Julia settled into her new role as the wife of Marius, she began to understand just how complex the world around her had become. Their home, once a peaceful refuge in the hills, now felt like the center of a storm. Marius, though not of noble birth, had quickly transformed into one of Rome's most important generals. The man who had risen from the ranks of the military had become a figure whose name would echo through the streets of the Republic for years to come. But even as Marius's influence grew, so too did the tensions within the Republic. Rome, by the time of their marriage in 110 BCE, was a republic at war with itself. The Senate, though still the ultimate political body, was deeply divided. The powerful Optimates, the traditionalist faction of the Senate, sought to preserve the old aristocratic order. In contrast, the Populars, a growing faction among the plebeians and the military, wanted to extend the power of the people and the army. These factions fought bitterly for control, each accusing the other of corruption and undermining the Republic's principles. Julia, now entrenched in the intricate web of Roman politics, began to see her own position more clearly. Her father, Gaius Julius Caesar, remained a respected figure within the Senate, but even his influence was no match for the power of the military. The Republic was beginning to show cracks, and Marius, with his reforms and ambitions, was at the heart of the turmoil. Marius had already proven himself as a tactician of unmatched skill. His leadership in the Jugurthine War had made him a hero in the eyes of the people, and his victory over the Germanic tribes of the Cimbri and Teutons solidified his reputation as one of Rome's greatest generals. But it wasn't just his military victories that set him apart. It was his vision for the future of Rome's military. Marius's reforms had changed the very nature of the Roman legions. No longer would soldiers be drawn from the ranks of the wealthy, but from the landless poor, the men who had no voice in the Senate but who were willing to fight for Rome. This was a radical change, one that threatened the old order and shifted the balance of power in the Republic. Julia watched as Marius's political influence grew. His repeated consulships, 6 in total, had given him unprecedented power. He was not merely a general now, he was a symbol of the changing tides in Rome. But the price of such power was steep. As Marius grew more powerful, so did his enemies. The Senate, alarmed by his influence, began to plot against him. Among his most powerful enemies was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a man whose ambition rivaled Marius's own. Sulla, a patrician from an old noble family, had been one of Marius's allies in the Jugurthine War. But Sulla's loyalty was always tempered by his own desire for power, and it wasn't long before the two men found themselves at odds. Sulla, a brilliant military commander in his own right, felt that Marius's reforms had threatened the traditional structure of the Roman army. His pride and ambition led him to challenge Marius's authority in the Senate. Julia, now fully entrenched in the political life of Rome, could not ignore the tension between Marius and Sulla. She watched as her husband's political opponents slowly closed in, whispering behind his back, undermining his influence, and plotting to undo everything he had built. Marius, however, was no stranger to conflict. His rise had been marked by struggles, and he was prepared to face whatever challenges came his way. One evening, as Julia sat in their villa, a messenger arrived with word that Marius had been declared consul once again. This time for the year 86 BCE. It was a momentous victory for him, but one that came at a great cost. The Senate, angry at Marius's audacity to continue his reign, had pushed back against him. The political climate in Rome had become so volatile that the once united republic now seemed to be on the brink of civil war. For Julia, this moment was the pinnacle of her husband's power and the beginning of a new, more dangerous chapter. She had always known that power came with a price, but nothing could have prepared her for the violence and bloodshed that was to come. Marius's re-election in 86 BCE was not without its challenges. While the plebeians celebrated his victory, the Senate seethed with anger. The Senate had long viewed Marius as a populist, a man who represented the interests of the common people rather than the traditional Roman elite. Marius, in turn, viewed the Senate as an obstacle to Rome's progress. His disdain for the traditional structures of Roman politics grew, and he began to see the Senate not as a body of wisdom but as a faction of entrenched aristocrats who were more concerned with their own power than with the welfare of Rome. The year 87 BCE was a turning point. Marius, despite being elected consul, found himself in direct conflict with Sulla. The conflict between the two men had been brewing for years, but now, with Marius holding the consulship once again, the rivalry reached its peak. Sulla, who had been given command of the war in the east against King Mithridates VI of Pontus, was furious at the Senate's decision to place Marius in charge of the war. The Senate's action was seen as a direct challenge to his authority. Sulla, unwilling to bow to Marius's control, marched his army on Rome in a direct defiance of the Senate's orders. Marius, not one to back down from a fight, took immediate action. In a dramatic series of events, he seized control of Rome by force, expelling Sulla's supporters and reasserting his dominance over the city. It was a bold move, and it made clear that Marius was not afraid to take extreme measures to secure his power. But his victory was short-lived. Sulla, though temporarily ousted from Rome, would soon return with a vengeance. Julia, caught in the web of political strife, found herself torn between her loyalty to her husband and the inevitable consequences of his actions. Her marriage to Marius had always been one of political necessity, but she had come to care for him deeply. He was a man driven by a singular vision for Rome, a vision that often placed him at odds with the rest of the Republic. His passion and determination had won her respect, but it also made her realize that his thirst for power came at a great cost. In the weeks following Marius's takeover of Rome, Julia observed the city descend further into chaos. The streets of the capital, once bustling with commerce and conversation, now echoed with the sounds of soldiers marching, senators fleeing for their lives, and the cries of the people caught in the crossfire of political ambition. Marius, though victorious, had set the stage for a conflict that would engulf Rome for years to come. As she sat in the quiet of their villa, Julia could not help but wonder what the future held for her family. She knew that Marius's enemies would not rest. Sulla, embittered and vengeful, would eventually return with an army of his own, determined to reclaim the power he had lost. The Republic, once the shining beacon of Rome's greatness, now seemed to teeter on the edge of destruction. But in the eyes of Gaius Marius, there was no turning back. He had fought too hard to let his enemies undo everything he had built. He had made powerful allies, but he had also made powerful enemies. The war for Rome's soul was just beginning, and Julia, though powerless in the grand scheme of things, knew that her role as the wife of one of the Republic's greatest generals would forever tie her to the fate of the Republic itself. The political firestorm that had engulfed Rome in the years following Marius's re-election had reached its inevitable peak. The Republic, once an institution of order and relative stability, was now a city divided, its very foundations trembling under the weight of civil strife. And at the center of it all stood Julia, wife of Gaius Marius, who watched helplessly as the world she knew spiraled toward destruction. As Marius sought to consolidate his power, his enemies rallied against him. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a man who had once fought alongside Marius in the Jugurthine War, now stood as the leading figure in the Optimates, the conservative faction of the Senate. The rivalry between the two men had reached a point of no return. Both men, driven by ambition and pride, refused to yield to the other. In the year 88 BCE, Sulla, furious over the Senate's decision to give Marius command of the war against King Mithridates of Pontus, marched his army on Rome. It was the first time in Roman history that a Roman general had marched his troops into the city. The act was seen as an unprecedented threat to the Republic itself. Sulla's coup marked the beginning of a brutal power struggle, and the first true rupture in the structure of Roman governance. The Senate, in a desperate move to regain control, fled the city, leaving Marius to seize the reins of power. Julia, now deeply enmeshed in the political drama, could not help but feel a sense of dread as she saw the republic that her family had once held so dear crumble around her. She had long known that power, in Rome, was as fleeting as it was intoxicating. Her marriage to Marius had brought her wealth and prestige, but it had also placed her in the very heart of Rome's violent political games. Her role as a wife of a consul, a leader of men, had taken her far from the quiet life she had once known in her father's house. But now, as the streets of Rome ran red with blood, she wondered if the cost of this power was too high. For Marius, there was no retreat. His ambition had been forged in the fire of conflict, and he would not back down now. Though Sulla had been temporarily forced out of Rome, the conflict between the two men was far from over. Sulla, humiliated but not broken, would return with an army to reclaim his place at the head of the Republic. Marius, sensing the growing threat, fortified his position, securing alliances with the plebeian class and the soldiers whose loyalty he had earned through his military reforms. But the price of Marius's power came in the form of bloodshed. His actions were not those of a statesman, but of a conqueror, in his bid to maintain control over the Republic. He used the armies at his disposal to enforce his will. Political rivals, including those who had once been his allies, were slaughtered in the streets. The Senate, now a symbol of old Rome, was dismantled, and with it, the Republic itself began to erode. Julia, now at the center of this storm, found herself torn between the man she had married and the man she was beginning to fear. Marius had once seemed a man of vision, an innovator, a reformer who sought to build a better Rome. But now, as she watched him command his armies with an iron fist, she wondered if the price of his ambition had led him too far from the ideals of the Republic. The return of Sulla to Rome in 83 BCE marked the beginning of a new chapter in the civil war that had gripped the Republic for the better part of a decade. With an army of loyal soldiers behind him, Sulla marched once again on the city. This time, he would not be denied. Sulla's forces clashed with Marius's, and what followed was one of the bloodiest and most violent chapters in Roman history. The battle for control of Rome was not fought on the battlefield alone. It was a battle for the soul of the Republic. Both men, in their thirst for power, had become forces of destruction, tearing apart the very fabric of Roman society. For Julia, the reality of her husband's struggle was painfully clear, as Marius and Sulla's forces engaged in a bloody civil war. The once great city of Rome was now a battlefield. It was in these dark days that Julia began to question the choices that had brought her to this point. She had once believed in the power of the Republic, in the strength of the Senate and the system that had governed Rome for centuries. But as she looked around at the devastation wrought by Marius and Sulla's conflict, she wondered if the Republic had been doomed from the start. The war between Marius and Sulla was marked by cruelty and violence. Sulla, known for his ruthlessness, spared no one in his quest for revenge. His soldiers hunted down Marius's supporters, and the streets of Rome were filled with the bodies of the fallen. In the wake of Sulla's victory, a brutal campaign of proscriptions ensued, in which thousands of Marius's allies were executed without trial. Marius, now in his mid-60s and frail from years of campaigning, could not withstand the assault from Sulla's forces. He retreated to the city of Minturni, where, broken and defeated, he waited for the inevitable. It was in the year 86 BCE that Marius died. His life and his dreams of a new Rome shattered by the very forces he had once sought to control. With Marius's death, Sulla assumed control of the Republic. The years following his victory saw the Republic transformed under his rule. Sulla's reforms were far-reaching. He sought to restore the Senate's power and to curb the growing influence of the military in Roman politics. He would become the first man in Roman history to march his army into the city twice and to take control of the government by force. But for Julia, the death of her husband was not just the end of Marius's political career. It marked the end of an era for the Republic itself. Rome was no longer the shining beacon of Republican ideals that it had once been. The power of the Senate was now in the hands of men like Sulla, whose reign of terror would pave the way for the rise of Julius Caesar, the man who would eventually bring an end to the Republic altogether. As Marius's widow, Julia found herself caught between two worlds, the old Rome that had once stood as a model of civic virtue, and the new Rome that had emerged from the ashes of civil war. She had been a part of something great, but now, as she looked upon the ruins of the Republic, she wondered if it had all been in vain. Her legacy, too, was tied to the fate of the Republic. Julia had been a woman who had witnessed the rise and fall of one of Rome's greatest generals, a woman whose life had been shaped by the ambitions of men like Marius and Sulla. And yet, as the Republic fell into chaos, Julia remained a symbol of a time that was now lost, a time when Rome was still a republic, when its destiny had been in the hands of its people. Julia had long been accustomed to the harsh tides of Roman politics, where power shifted like the winds, and betrayal was as common as victory. But nothing could have prepared her for the solitude that gripped her after Marius's death. Gaius Marius, once the most powerful man in Rome, lay dead in Minturni, his ambition and dreams shattered by the weight of his own actions. The political world, so turbulent and fraught with danger during his lifetime, seemed to collapse entirely after his death, leaving Julia alone to pick up the pieces of her broken life. In the aftermath of Marius's fall, Julia had not just lost her husband, she had lost the power, prestige, and position that came with being the wife of one of Rome's greatest generals. She was now a widow in a city that knew only the language of power and survival. The streets of Rome, once vibrant with the promises of reform and revolution under Marius, were now filled with the sounds of power plays, coups, and the desperate scramble of men seeking to control the remnants of the Republic. Sulla's victory had been swift and brutal. After defeating Marius and his allies, Sulla had marched into Rome, forcing the Senate to acquiesce to his will. He had executed a series of proscriptions, bloody purges in which he hunted down Marius's supporters and anyone who might pose a threat to his rule. Thousands of Romans had died in the streets, their blood staining the very heart of the city. For Julia, the days following Marius's death were marked by a deep, abiding grief. Her husband, despite his flaws and his ruthlessness, had been a force of nature, a man who had reshaped Rome's military and political landscape. Now, in his absence, she found herself swept along by forces beyond her control. Though she no longer had the ear of the Senate or the loyalty of the legions, her connections to the Julii family remained intact. Her father, Gaius Julius Caesar, still held considerable influence in the Senate, though he too felt the weight of the changing times. As Sulla consolidated his power, Julia was forced to watch the very republic that she had once believed in disintegrate before her eyes. Rome was no longer a city of ideals, it was a city of generals, of men who used the legions as pawns in their struggle for dominance. The old order, represented by the Senate and the aristocracy, had crumbled under the weight of military ambition. And in this new world, Julia could see no place for the once proud ideals of Roman republicanism. But Julia, ever the survivor, knew that she could not simply fade into obscurity. Despite the chaos that had engulfed Rome, her position as the widow of Gaius Marius still held some weight. She could still influence the factions that controlled the city, and she would use whatever power she had left to secure the future of her family. It was in this period of personal loss and political disarray that Julia's life would intersect once more with the name that had come to dominate the Republic, Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar, Julia's cousin, was a man whose ambition and cunning were beginning to take shape in the world of Roman politics. He had long been a member of the nobility, but unlike many of his peers, he understood the power of the military and the people. Caesar had seen firsthand the destruction wrought by the conflict between Marius and Sulla, and he had learned the lessons of those bloody years well. If he were to rise to power, he would need more than just political connections. He would need the loyalty of the people and the strength of the legions. Though Julia and Julius Caesar had not been close during their early years, her widowhood brought them into a new alignment. Caesar, ever the opportunist, recognized the potential in securing his position by forging alliances with the remnants of Marius's supporters. He understood that to achieve his ultimate goal of becoming the most powerful man in Rome, he needed not only the support of the Senate but also the backing of the military, an area where his cousin Gaius Marius had once excelled. Caesar's political rise was swift and, at times, ruthless. His family, the Julii, had deep roots in Roman history, but Caesar knew that his noble birth alone would not secure him the power he sought. He needed to make his name known, to show the people that he was a man of action and not just a figurehead of aristocratic lineage. He threw himself into public life, securing his first political office as quaestor in 69 BCE. From there, he moved swiftly through the ranks, leveraging his family connections, his wit, and his ability to charm the people. Julia, for her part, watched her cousin's rise with a mixture of admiration and unease. She had always known that the Julii were powerful, but Caesar's ambition seemed boundless. He was a man driven by something greater than just political gain. He was driven by a vision of Rome that, like Marius before him, would challenge the very foundations of the Republic. As Caesar's influence in Rome grew, Julia began to play a more active role in his political maneuvering. She had no desire to return to the public eye as a political figure in her own right, but she knew that her position as the widow of Marius could serve as a bridge between the old guard of Marius's followers and the new wave of political reform that Caesar was championing. The two cousins, though separated by their respective legacies, found common ground in their desire for change. Julia became an influential advisor to Caesar in these early years of his career. She helped him navigate the treacherous waters of Roman politics, offering insight into the dynamics of power and the delicate balance between the Senate and the military. In return, Caesar, ever the shrewd tactician, began to court Julia's approval and respect. He understood that, as the widow of Marius, she could provide him with valuable allies and a legitimacy that he might otherwise struggle to attain. Despite her growing involvement in Caesar's political ascent, Julia never lost sight of the personal cost of her actions. She had once been a symbol of Roman republicanism, a wife to a general who sought to reform the very fabric of Roman society. But now, as she watched Caesar's rise, she realized that the republic she had known was no more. Rome was shifting from a republic of senators and citizens to a Rome ruled by generals and autocrats. Her position in Caesar's orbit became even more crucial when, in 59 BCE, Caesar entered into one of the most important alliances of his career, the First Triumvirate. Along with Pompey and Crassus, two of Rome's most powerful men, Caesar secured his political future and positioned himself as the most formidable figure in the Republic. Julia's role in the First Triumvirate was not just symbolic, it was strategic. As the wife of Caesar's ally Pompey, Julia became the glue that held the triumvirs together. In many ways, she was the hidden hand behind the success of Caesar's alliance. The marriage between Julia and Pompey was not one of love, but one of necessity. Julia's political insight, shaped by years of navigating the complexities of Roman power, made her a crucial player in the balancing act of the triumvirate. Yet, as Julia grew older and the power struggles within the triumvirate intensified, she began to feel the weight of the choices she had made. The world of her youth, where she had believed in the ideal of Roman democracy, was long gone. What replaced it was a system of patronage, military loyalty, and personal ambition. Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus were no longer just political figures, they were the future of Rome. and their rise to power would reshape the Republic in ways that no one, not even Julia, could predict. Her political alliances, though important, began to feel like chains, binding her to a new order that seemed to leave little room for the ideals she had once cherished. And as the political tide shifted again, with Caesar's victory in Gaul and the growing tensions between Pompey and Caesar, Julia found herself once more caught in the middle of Rome's ever-changing political landscape. By the year 54 BCE, Rome had undergone a profound transformation, and with it, Julia's own life had shifted beyond recognition. No longer simply the widow of Gaius Marius, she had become a key figure in the political drama that defined the final days of the Roman Republic. Her marriage to Pompey had positioned her at the very heart of the powerful alliance known as the First Triumvirate, which united Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus in an unprecedented coalition. But it was a union forged more from necessity than affection, as Julia's role had always been one of mediator and political stabilizer. Yet, as her life had become increasingly intertwined with that of Julius Caesar and Pompey, she had also been swept up in the whirlwind of Rome's changing fortunes, one that was rapidly spinning out of control. She had been a figure of strength and insight, and her role had been essential to the tenuous peace between the triumvirs. But in this moment, with the political alliances fracturing and ambitions soaring to new heights, Julia knew that she stood at the precipice of a new and uncertain future. Her marriage to Pompey was not a passionate love affair, but a political necessity, a bridge between two of the most powerful men in Rome. Pompey, with his military might and strategic acumen, had been a formidable force in Rome's shifting balance of power. Caesar, on the other hand, had won the loyalty of legions across Gaul and had emerged as the most dangerous and charismatic figure in Roman politics. Both men, while bound by their shared interests, had come to see one another as rivals rather than partners. The fragile alliance that Julia had once nurtured was beginning to unravel, and with it, the world she had worked so hard to protect. It was in the spring of 54 BCE that the first blow to the Triumvirate came, as Crassus, the wealthiest and most politically savvy member of the alliance, met his end in the east. Crassus's ill-fated campaign against the Parthian Empire ended with his defeat at the Battle of Carrhae, a catastrophic loss that left Rome reeling. With Crassus dead, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. No longer could the three men rule with a shared vision. Pompey and Caesar, now without the stabilizing influence of Crassus, found themselves at odds, their ambitions becoming ever more pronounced and dangerous. The fragility of the triumvirate was further exposed by the death of Julia herself. In the summer of 54 BCE, when Julia was in her early 30s, she became pregnant with Pompey's child. The pregnancy, which was already complicated, took a tragic turn when Julia went into premature labor and died. The loss of Julia was not just a personal tragedy for Pompey and Caesar. It was a blow to the fragile political equilibrium that the triumvirs had so carefully maintained. For Pompey, the death of his wife marked the loss of his greatest political ally. Julia had been the one person who could bring him and Caesar together, and without her, their relationship began to deteriorate quickly. Caesar, despite his grief for the cousin he had once considered a close confidant, knew that the balance of power was now irrevocably shifting. With Julia gone, the alliance between Caesar and Pompey collapsed, and the long-anticipated conflict between the two men began to take shape. The once united front of the triumvirate had now fractured, and the political divide between Pompey and Caesar deepened. Julia's death, though tragic on a personal level, had profound political consequences. In the wake of her passing, the alliances that had held the Republic together, however tenuous, began to crumble. Pompey, now more vulnerable without his wife's influence over Caesar, sought to align himself with the Senate. Meanwhile, Caesar, with his growing popularity and his legions still loyal to him, prepared for a new phase of his career, one that would involve not just political maneuvering but also military conquest. In many ways, Julia's death marked the final turning point in the Republic's transition from a system of shared power to one dominated by individual ambition. For Pompey, the loss of Julia was devastating on both a personal and political level. Without the familial connection to Caesar, he found himself in a much weaker position. His previous alliances and popularity had been built on his military successes. But now he faced the daunting reality of being politically isolated in Rome. Caesar, still in Gaul, continued to expand his influence, and Pompey struggled to counter the momentum of his rival. Pompey had been a great general, but his political instincts were not as sharp as Caesar's. Lacking a strong, unifying figure in his camp, Pompey increasingly turned to the Senate for support. This would prove to be a fatal misstep, as the Senate, eager to curb Caesar's growing power, began to distance itself from Pompey and increasingly sought to support Pompey's rival. The Senate's attempts to curtail Caesar's influence in Gaul were seen as a direct challenge, and soon, the two men found themselves on a collision course. Caesar's victory in Gaul had secured him a reputation as one of Rome's most powerful generals. As he returned to Rome in 49 BCE, he was faced with the prospect of an inevitable civil war. The Senate, now firmly aligned with Pompey, demanded that Caesar disband his army and return as a private citizen. Caesar, ever the master of political calculation, refused to back down. He crossed the Rubicon River with his legions, famously declaring, "The die is cast." With this single act, Caesar plunged Rome into civil war. The ensuing conflict between Caesar and Pompey would forever alter the course of Roman history. The battle lines were drawn, and the fate of the Republic hung in the balance. Pompey, with the support of the Senate and a large portion of the Roman aristocracy, sought to challenge Caesar on the battlefield. Caesar, confident in the loyalty of his legions, marched forward, seeking to consolidate his power and crush Pompey's forces. But as the war raged on, Julia's absence was keenly felt by both men. For Pompey, the loss of his wife and political ally had left him vulnerable. Without Julia's ability to mediate between him and Caesar, Pompey's position had become precarious. For Caesar, the death of his beloved cousin was not only a personal tragedy but also a symbolic loss that marked the end of the Triumvirate as an effective political entity. The final confrontation between Caesar and Pompey came in 48 BCE, when the two armies met at the Battle of Pharsalus. The battle was a decisive victory for Caesar, and Pompey, fleeing the battlefield, sought refuge in Egypt. But his escape was short-lived. Upon arriving in Egypt, Pompey was murdered by order of the young Pharaoh Ptolemy XIII, who hoped to curry favor with Caesar. Pompey's death marked the end of the Republic as it had been known. With his rival eliminated, Caesar emerged as the undisputed leader of Rome. But the victory was bittersweet, for Julia's death had been the catalyst for the unraveling of everything she had worked to build. The Republic was no more. It was a monarchy in the making, and Caesar's vision for Rome was one that would forever alter its course. In the years that followed, Caesar would go on to become dictator for life, a title that would cement his place in history. But as he sat at the height of his power, he could not forget the role that Julia had played in his rise. She had been the bridge between him and Pompey, the person who had once held together the very heart of Roman politics. Without her, the Republic had slipped into the chaos of civil war, and the future of Rome would no longer be determined by the Senate, but by a single man. The year was 44 BCE. Rome, now under the weight of Caesar's ambitions and autocratic rule, stood at a crossroads. The Republic was no more, its ideals buried beneath the might of legions and the personality of one man, Julius Caesar. Yet, even as Caesar basked in the glory of his unprecedented power, the shadows of his past decisions loomed large, and those who had once helped him ascend to the pinnacle of Roman politics found themselves entangled in the consequences of their actions. At the heart of this transformation lay the tragic figure of Julia, whose death had been the catalyst for the final unraveling of the Triumvirate. Her absence had created a rift between Caesar and Pompey, one that would eventually ignite into civil war, and ultimately lead to the rise of Caesar as the undisputed ruler of Rome. Julia had been more than just a wife, more than just a political pawn in the games of the powerful. She had been a symbol of the delicate balance that had once held the Republic together. Her loss was not just personal, it was political, and it reverberated across the very foundations of Rome. In the aftermath of Julia's death, the political landscape had shifted irrevocably. The last remnants of the old Republic were slowly being erased, replaced by the authoritarian regime of Caesar. The Senate, once the beating heart of Roman governance, had become little more than a rubber-stamp body, its power subsumed by Caesar's growing influence. The legions, those pillars of Roman strength, no longer answered to the Senate, they answered to Caesar, who had made them his own. But for all his military prowess and political genius, Caesar was not immune to the forces of fate. The very power that had made him great now sowed the seeds of his downfall. His rule, though absolute, was built on a foundation of tension between the people who adored him, the senators who resented him, and the men who had once been his allies, now wary of his unchecked authority. Caesar's rise had been swift and decisive, but it was not without its challenges. His military campaigns, his reforms, and his ambitions had made him both beloved and feared. To the people of Rome, Caesar was a hero, a man who had brought glory to the Republic through his conquests in Gaul. But to the Senate, he was a tyrant, a man who threatened to dismantle the very institutions that had once held Rome together. It was during the Ides of March in 44 BCE that the culmination of this tension came to a head. Caesar, despite his great accomplishments and the adoration of the masses, found himself surrounded by enemies within the Senate, a group of senators who feared his growing power and saw him as a threat to the Republic itself. The conspirators, led by Brutus and Cassius, plotted his assassination, hoping that by killing Caesar, they could restore the Senate's authority and return Rome to its republican roots. The assassination of Caesar was a moment of profound irony. Though Caesar had sought to control the fate of Rome, it was the very political structure he had once dominated that turned against him in his final hours. It was as if the Republic, in its last throes, could not accept the autocracy that Caesar had imposed upon it. And yet, in this act of violence, the conspirators had miscalculated the depth of Caesar's legacy. The death of Julius Caesar did not usher in the restoration of the Republic. Instead, it opened the door to further chaos and civil war. In the wake of Caesar's assassination, his supporters, chief among them Mark Antony, Caesar's right-hand man, sought to avenge his death and solidify his legacy. The power vacuum left by Caesar's murder was quickly filled by his loyalists. But the path to succession was far from clear. Julia's role in this turbulent period was more than just a historical footnote. Though she had passed away years earlier, her legacy continued to reverberate through the actions of her family. Her father, Gaius Julius Caesar, had shaped the politics of Rome, and her cousin, Julius Caesar, had changed the very fabric of Roman society. But in the wake of his death, it was Caesar's heir, Octavian, later Augustus, who would emerge as the true successor, forging a new dynasty and ushering in the Roman Empire. Octavian, who had been Caesar's grandnephew and adopted son, found himself in a precarious position. Though Caesar's assassination had weakened his authority, Octavian quickly began to consolidate his power, seeking to avenge his adoptive father and assert control over the Roman world. His rivalry with Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant, would define the next phase of Roman history, though Julia herself had passed away long before the rise of Augustus. Her memory and influence remained a subtle yet crucial part of his ascent. She had been a bridge between two powerful men, Pompey and Caesar, and her death had altered the course of history. But it also had a lasting impact on the political landscape of Rome. For Augustus, the memory of his great-uncle Julius Caesar was a tool he would use in his own rise to power. Caesar had been revered as a god after his death, and Augustus, seeking to secure his legitimacy, embraced the mantle of Caesar's heir. The political reforms and military victories that Caesar had begun were carried forward by Augustus, who would go on to become the first emperor of Rome. But it was not just Caesar's political and military achievements that left a mark on Rome. His family, the Julii, had become the most important political house in the Roman world. Augustus, though born Gaius Octavius, would adopt the name Julius Caesar in a public declaration, cementing his position as Caesar's rightful successor. The bloodlines of the Julii had come to represent the very power structure of Rome, and it was under Augustus's reign that Rome would transition from a fragile republic to a mighty empire. And yet, in this new world of empire and imperial power, the memory of Julia, her wisdom, her political acumen, her role in the grand machinations of the Roman elite, remained present in the very actions of those who followed. Though the Republic had been extinguished, its ideals, embodied in figures like Julia, would live on in the hearts of those who remembered what Rome had once stood for. Julia's life, though brief, had played a significant role in the defining moments of Roman history. As the daughter of Gaius Julius Caesar and wife to the great general Gaius Marius, she had been caught in the crossfire of political forces far beyond her control. She had witnessed the rise and fall of her husband, the shift from republican ideals to the dominance of military generals, and the eventual collapse of the Triumvirate. Her death had marked the end of a chapter in Rome's history, but it also set the stage for the eventual rise of Caesar's heir, Augustus, and the birth of the Roman Empire. In the end, Julia's influence could not be measured solely by her direct actions. Her legacy was one that echoed through the actions of those who came after her, through Caesar, Augustus, and the empire they built. The Republic may have fallen, but the ideals that Julia had once championed lived on in the transformation of Rome into something greater, something new. Her name, though forgotten by many, had been etched into the annals of history, not just as the wife of Marius or the daughter of Caesar, but as a symbol of the shifting tides of Roman power. The Republic had been lost, but its echoes lived on in the empire that would follow. Julia had been a quiet, but indelible, part of that story. As the dust settled over the corpse of Julius Caesar and Rome faced the consequences of its shift from republic to empire, the story of Julia, the woman whose life had once bridged the fractures between mighty men and powerful houses, seemed to fade into the annals of history. The figure of Julia, though immortalized in the lives and ambitions of those closest to her, had become a symbol of the irretrievable loss that came with the collapse of the Roman Republic. She had been a daughter, a wife, a mother, and a political force, yet her death had signaled the twilight of an age that would never return. The transformation of Rome from a republic to an empire was not merely a change in political structure. It was a redefinition of identity, and in this redefinition, the old ideals of Roman governance, rooted in shared power, mutual respect, and the careful balancing of competing interests, were increasingly lost. It was the end of a world, and the birth of a new one, a world that was irrevocably shaped by the ambitions of the men who stood after her, but a world that Julia, in her quiet influence, had prepared them to inherit. By the time the Civil War had ended, and Augustus emerged victorious, Rome had been irrevocably changed. The republican system, with its Senate, magistrates, and elected officials, had been replaced by an empire ruled by a single man, the emperor. Augustus, the adopted son of Julius Caesar, had consolidated his power after defeating Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. What followed was not merely a shift in military control, but a profound change in how Rome viewed itself and its governance. For Augustus, the image of the Republic was not something to be discarded completely, but something to be revered and repurposed. He positioned himself as princeps, the first among equals, a title that carefully avoided the perception of kingship, though in truth, he wielded absolute power. He was not a monarch. He declared, He was the restorer of the Republic. This rhetoric, while crafted to soothe those who might have resisted the notion of absolute rule, was deeply deceptive. For Augustus, the consolidation of power was always the ultimate goal. Beneath his carefully crafted image as a man of the people lay the iron will of a ruler who was determined to forge a new era in Rome's history. And it was in this new world that the name of Julia, once a symbol of republican diplomacy and political marriages, took on a new significance. The Roman people, whose dreams of republican restoration had long been shattered, came to worship Augustus as the bringer of peace and order. His reforms, military victories, and the prosperous Pax Romana allowed the city to flourish. But it was also under Augustus that the memory of Julia was reshaped. No longer a mere figurehead, Julia's death had been a pivotal moment that had set the stage for Augustus's rise. In the imperial court of Augustus, the legacy of the Julii family, embodied in both Julius Caesar and his daughter Julia, was instrumental in cementing the new order. Augustus carefully cultivated his connection to his adoptive father, making use of Caesar's deification to strengthen his own claim to legitimacy. The public saw Augustus not as a newcomer, but as the heir to a legacy of military genius and political mastery. The memory of Julia, as her image was now represented in the political culture of Augustus's reign, continued to echo in the new era, a time of imperial dominance, political control, and economic prosperity. Julia had lived during a time of unprecedented political change, a time when the very fabric of Rome was being rewritten by the hands of men like Caesar, Pompey, and Marius. Yet, her life, while intertwined with the destinies of these great men, had also been defined by the tragedy of personal loss and the erosion of the Republic's foundations. By the time Augustus stood at the zenith of Roman power, the Republic, in which Julia had played her pivotal role, had been reduced to little more than a memory. For Rome's future emperors, the fall of the Republic was both a tragic and necessary event. The Republic had been plagued by corruption, civil wars, and the erosion of civic virtue. Rome's senators had become little more than pawns in the game of ambitious generals and political factionalism. The hope of restoring the Republic to its former glory had long since passed. Even those who had lived and died with the ideals of the Republic, like Julia, had seen firsthand the challenges of preserving a system built on shared authority. It was no surprise, then, that Augustus, now the undisputed ruler of Rome, took steps to consolidate his power in ways that would ensure the stability of the empire for generations to come. But as he did, the Republic's death was mourned not just as a political loss, but as the death of a way of life that had once prided itself on collective decision-making and the rule of law. Augustus did not simply inherit the legacy of Caesar and the Julii, he redefined it. While Augustus's reign ushered in an era of stability, it also marked the end of the traditional Roman way of governance. The Senate, once the heart of Roman political life, became an institution of limited influence, its authority reduced to ceremonial duties. The power of the people, once embodied in the popular assemblies, was relegated to insignificance. And while the imperial family, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, grew ever more powerful, it was the image of the emperor, rather than the collective will of the Senate or the people, that became the defining feature of Roman politics. Julia, as a central figure in the history of the Republic's fall, had played her part in the story. Her death had been the turning point, the moment that marked the end of the old Roman order. Yet, in her absence, her legacy lived on through the choices of those who had followed in her wake. Despite her essential role in the shaping of Roman history, Julia herself would not remain long in the collective memory of the people. The historical record would come to focus instead on the towering figures of Caesar and Augustus, men whose legacies were shaped by conquest, military genius, and imperial power. Julia, who had stood in the shadows of those giants, was gradually forgotten in the pages of history, but her legacy lived on in the quiet moments of reflection, in the rooms where the imperial family gathered to strategize, and in the halls of the Senate, where the echo of the Republic lingered like a whisper, her political savvy, her role as a mediator, and the sacrifices she had made for the sake of Rome were all part of the foundation upon which Augustus built his empire. The careful balance that Julia had once embodied between power, family, and diplomacy was the very thing that had kept the Republic alive, if only for a moment longer. It was in the minds of those closest to her, in the hearts of the children she had borne, and in the reflection of Augustus's own rise to power that Julia's legacy would live on. She had been more than just a wife, more than just the daughter of Caesar. She had been a symbol of Roman virtues of loyalty, political acumen, and the power of family. And though she may have faded from the official histories, her influence could still be seen in the corridors of power, in the way Rome would shape itself for centuries to come. The rise of Augustus and the imperial system marked the end of the Roman Republic. But the memory of the Republic, and of those who had lived and died in its name, continued to inform the empire for generations. Augustus, despite his title and his authority, could never completely erase the spirit of the Republic from the Roman consciousness. The power of the Senate, the ideals of Roman citizenship, and the virtues of public service all remained woven into the fabric of Roman identity, even as they were slowly diluted by imperial rule. For the people of Rome, the empire represented a new chapter in their history, one that offered peace, prosperity, and stability after centuries of civil war. But for those who remembered the old days, the loss of the Republic was a tragedy. Julia, though long dead, remained in their collective memory as a reminder of the time when Rome had been governed by the ideals of the Senate and the wisdom of its leaders. As Augustus's reign continued and his successors cemented the imperial system, the question of Rome's identity became ever more pressing. Was Rome still the republic it had once been? Or was it now something entirely new, an empire ruled by a singular figure, one whose power would be handed down from generation to generation? And how would the stories of those who had lived and died for the republic, like Julia, be remembered? In the end, Julia's story was not just one of political alliances and marriages. It was a story of resilience, sacrifice, and the enduring power of memory. Though she had been swept up in the tides of history, her influence remained, for in the end, it was the memory of figures like Julia, figures who had borne witness to the last days of the Republic and had played their part in the creation of a new empire that would shape the future of Rome, and, by extension, the future of the world.